Sister Catherine entered the convent, thinking she would find peace through prayer and devotion to God in a sacred sanctuary. What she didn't know was that medieval nuns were required to confess their most intimate thoughts and desires to male priests in explicit detail, whipped naked to drive out the devil from their bodies, and forced to consume hallucinogenic herbs to induce holy visions during nighttime prayers. Because in medieval Christianity, the female body was considered the devil's playground that needed constant purification through suffering. Welcome to Historical Stories for Sleeping. Before we begin this incredible story of Sister Catherine, whose search for spiritual peace in a medieval convent taught her that religious devotion for women meant systematic destruction of the self through sanctified torture, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you believe that true spirituality should uplift rather than destroy the human spirit, hit that subscribe button and share this story to help us remember those who suffered in the name of salvation. Catherine de Montfort was 16 years old when she first heard the calling that would lead her to the gates of the convent of St. Clare, nestled in the shadow of Canterbury Cathedral in the year 1347. The decision to enter religious life had not been entirely her own. Her father, facing financial ruin after a series of failed harvests, could no longer afford to provide dowries for all three of his daughters. The convent offered a respectable alternative to an unwanted marriage, a place where his middle daughter could find purpose and salvation while relieving the family of the burden of her support. "You will find peace there, my child," her mother had assured her as they prepared her meager possessions for the journey. The sisters live in harmony with God, devoted to prayer and contemplation, free from the troubles and temptations of the worldly life. It is a blessed existence. Catherine had embraced this vision wholeheartedly. She imagined herself spending her days in quiet prayer, copying illuminated manuscripts in the scriptorium, tending the convent gardens, and finding the spiritual fulfillment that seemed impossible in the harsh realities of medieval secular life. The idea of dedicating herself entirely to God's service filled her with a sense of purpose and anticipation that made the prospect of leaving her family bearable. The convent of St. Clare appeared magnificent as Catherine approached its walls for the first time. The stone buildings rose like a small city within the countryside, surrounded by high walls that spoke of security and separation from the violent world beyond. Gardens visible through iron gates showed neat rows of herbs and vegetables, while the sound of bells calling the sisters to prayer created an atmosphere of ordered sanctity that seemed to promise exactly the peace her mother had described. Mother Superior Agatha greeted Catherine in the convent's reception hall, a tall, severe woman whose pale complexion and hollow eyes suggested decades of extreme ascetic practice. Her welcome was formal but not unkind, though Catherine noticed something unsettling in the older woman's gaze, a calculating quality that seemed to evaluate her not as a person seeking spiritual guidance, but as raw material to be shaped according to the convent's particular requirements. "Welcome, child," Mother Agatha said, her voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "You come to us seeking to serve God and purify your soul from the contamination of worldly existence. This is a noble calling, but it requires sacrifices that few truly understand until they have committed themselves completely to our way of life." The initial weeks of Catherine's religious education seemed to confirm her hopes for a life of meaningful spiritual practice. She learned the daily routine of prayers, participated in communal meals of simple but adequate food, and began instruction in the Latin texts that formed the foundation of Christian theology. The other sisters seemed devout and peaceful, moving through their duties with the serene efficiency of women who had found their proper place in God's plan. But gradually, Catherine began to notice aspects of convent life that troubled her. The dormitory where she slept was freezing cold even in summer, with sisters forbidden to use blankets or pillows that might provide comfort to their sinful flesh. Meals were sparse to the point of causing constant hunger, with fasting required not just during traditional religious periods, but whenever Mother Agatha deemed that someone needed additional purification. Most disturbing of all, Catherine observed that many of the older sisters bore scars on their arms and backs, marks that suggested regular and severe physical punishment. "Why do the sisters have those scars?" she asked Sister Margaret, a young woman who had arrived at the convent just 2 years earlier and who still retained some friendliness despite the enforced silence that governed most daily interactions. Margaret looked around nervously before answering in a whisper. "They are marks of devotion, Catherine. Here we learn that the body is the enemy of the soul, and that true spirituality requires the mortification of the flesh through suffering. You will understand soon enough, once your real training begins." The real training commenced on Catherine's 30th day in the convent, when Mother Agatha summoned her to a private chamber she had never seen before. The room was stark and windowless, furnished only with a wooden crucifix, a single chair, and various implements whose purposes Catherine could not immediately identify. The atmosphere was heavy with the scent of burning herbs and something else, an underlying odor of fear and pain that made her stomach clench with anxiety. "Today you begin your true education in the spiritual discipline required of a bride of Christ," Mother Agatha announced, her tone suggesting that this was a privilege rather than something to be feared. "The female body is inherently sinful, corrupted by Eve's transgression, and prone to evil thoughts and desires. To serve God properly, you must learn to overcome these weaknesses through practices that may seem harsh, but which are essential for salvation." What followed was Catherine's introduction to the systematic destruction of self that medieval convents practiced in the name of spiritual purification. The process began with confession, but not the simple admission of wrongdoing that she had expected. Instead, she was required to describe in explicit detail every thought, feeling, and physical sensation she had experienced, particularly those relating to her body and any desires that might be considered sexual or worldly. "Tell me about your dreams," Mother Agatha commanded, settling into her chair with the air of someone prepared for a long interrogation. "Describe every image, every feeling, every response your sinful flesh had to the visions that visited you during sleep." Catherine stammered through descriptions of perfectly innocent dreams, memories of home, fantasies about food when she was hungry, vague anxieties about her future in the convent. But Mother Agatha was not satisfied with these mundane confessions. She pressed for more intimate details, demanding to know about any dreams or thoughts that involved physical sensations, any awareness of her own body, any response to the presence of other people. "Have you ever felt warmth between your legs?" the Mother Superior asked with clinical directness. "Have you ever touched yourself in ways that brought pleasure? Have you ever looked at another person and felt stirrings of desire?" The questions were humiliating and invasive, but Catherine quickly learned that answering them was mandatory. Attempts to claim ignorance or innocence were met with accusations of lying and spiritual pride. She was required to examine her own thoughts and feelings with a level of scrutiny that transformed even the most innocent human responses into evidence of corruption and sin. "Your reluctance to speak honestly about your bodily experiences reveals the depth of your spiritual contamination," Mother Agatha declared after Catherine struggled to answer questions about physical sensations she barely understood. "You have been so corrupted by worldly existence that you cannot even recognize your own sinfulness. This makes your purification all the more urgent and necessary." This initial confession session lasted for over 3 hours, leaving Catherine emotionally drained and deeply confused about aspects of her own humanity that she had never been taught to consider sinful. But it was only the beginning of a process designed to strip away every aspect of her identity and replace it with something that the convent considered more suitable for serving God. The systematic destruction of Catherine's sense of self had begun, disguised as spiritual education and justified by theological principles that reduced women to vessels of corruption, requiring constant purification through suffering. Catherine's true education in what the convent called spiritual discipline began the morning after her first extended confession session. She was awakened before dawn by Sister Margaret, who led her to a chamber beneath the main chapel that she had not known existed. The underground room was lit by flickering candles and dominated by a large wooden cross mounted on the wall. But what drew Catherine's horrified attention were the implements arranged on tables around the chamber: whips, chains, sharp metal objects, and other devices whose purposes she could guess, but desperately hoped she was misunderstanding. "This is where we learn to mortify the flesh," Sister Margaret explained, her voice flat with the resignation of someone who had accepted the unacceptable. "Mother Agatha says that the female body is so corrupted by sin that gentle measures are insufficient. We must learn to inflict pain upon ourselves to drive out evil thoughts and desires." The practice of self-flagellation was presented as a sacred duty, a way of imitating Christ's suffering and purifying the soul through deliberate infliction of pain. Catherine was given a small whip made of knotted rope and instructed to strike herself across the back and shoulders while reciting prayers of contrition. The first blow was tentative and relatively painless, but Sister Margaret immediately corrected her technique. "You must strike harder," she said, taking the whip and demonstrating with a blow that left angry red marks across her own arm. "The pain must be real, must be severe enough to overcome the pleasure that your sinful flesh seeks. If you do not suffer, you are not learning." The logic was twisted but internally consistent within the convent's theological framework. Physical pleasure was considered evidence of spiritual corruption, so physical pain became a form of medicine designed to cure the soul's sickness. Catherine was required to whip herself for 30 minutes each morning before prayers, gradually increasing the force of the blows until she was drawing blood and leaving permanent scars on her skin. But self-inflicted punishment was only one aspect of the convent's approach to spiritual discipline. The sisters were also subjected to regular examinations by Father Benedict, the priest who served as their confessor and spiritual director. These examinations were presented as necessary medical and spiritual procedures designed to ensure that the nuns were properly purifying themselves and remaining free from demonic influence. "The devil often hides within the female body," Father Benedict explained during Catherine's first examination, his hands already moving to unlace her rough woolen habit. "I must inspect you carefully to ensure that no evil spirits have taken residence in your flesh." The examination was a degrading violation disguised as medical necessity. Father Benedict claimed that he needed to check for physical signs of spiritual corruption, unusual marks, sensitivity in certain areas, or responses that might indicate demonic possession. Catherine was required to stand naked while he touched and probed her body, all while maintaining the pretense that this was a holy procedure designed for her spiritual benefit. "Do you feel any unusual sensations when I touch you here?" he would ask, his hands exploring areas of her body that no one had ever touched before. Any warmth or pleasure could indicate that evil spirits are using your flesh for their own purposes. If Catherine showed any physical response to his touch, which was inevitable given the intimate nature of the examination, Father Benedict would declare it evidence of spiritual corruption requiring additional purification. This would lead to more severe flagellation, extended periods of fasting, or other punishments designed to drive out the evil influences that were supposedly manifesting through her body's natural responses. The twisted logic of these practices was that any normal human reaction was reinterpreted as evidence of sin. If Catherine felt pain during flagellation, it proved that her flesh was rebelling against righteous discipline. If she felt no pain, it proved that she was not being severe enough in her self-punishment. If she responded physically to intimate touching, it proved demonic influence. If she showed no response, it proved that she was suppressing her reactions out of spiritual pride. Perhaps most disturbing was the way these practices were presented as expressions of divine love. Mother Agatha regularly reminded the sisters that their suffering was a gift they were offering to God, a way of participating in Christ's passion and earning salvation through deliberate self-destruction. "Your pain is prayer," she would tell them during the morning flagellation sessions. "Your blood is sacrifice. Your broken flesh is the only offering you have that is worthy of God's attention. Embrace your suffering as a lover embraces her beloved." The language of spiritual love was deliberately mixed with imagery that had sexual undertones, creating a confused psychological state where pain became associated with devotion and violation was reframed as Holy Communion. Catherine found herself unable to distinguish between worship and abuse, between spiritual growth and systematic destruction of her sense of self. Days, weeks turned to months. The constant cycle of confession, examination, and punishment began to break down Catherine's resistance and her ability to think clearly about her situation. The combination of malnutrition, sleep deprivation, regular physical pain, and psychological manipulation created a state of mind where even the most obviously abusive practices seemed normal and necessary. She began to look forward to the flagellation sessions as moments of spiritual intensity, to accept the invasive examinations as expressions of concern for her spiritual welfare, and to interpret her own suffering as evidence that she was finally learning to serve God properly. The transformation was gradual but complete. She was becoming exactly what the convent system was designed to create, a woman who had internalized her own oppression so thoroughly that she could no longer recognize it as abuse. The girl who had entered the convent seeking spiritual peace had been systematically destroyed and replaced with something that could accept unlimited suffering as a form of worship. And the most tragic aspect of this transformation was that Catherine herself had come to believe it was what God wanted from her. 3 months into her time at the convent, Catherine was introduced to what Mother Agatha called the highest form of spiritual practice, the consumption of sacred herbs that would allegedly allow her to experience direct visions of the divine realm. These sessions took place in the same underground chamber where flagellation occurred, but they were presented as a privilege reserved for sisters who had proven their dedication through sufficient self-mortification. "Tonight you will drink the sacred wine that opens the soul to God's direct communication," Mother Agatha announced as she prepared a goblet filled with dark liquid that smelled of bitter herbs and something else Catherine could not identify. Many sisters are not strong enough in their faith to receive such visions safely. The fact that you are being offered this opportunity shows that your spiritual purification is progressing successfully. The liquid was bitter and burned Catherine's throat as she swallowed it, but she forced herself to drink the entire goblet, while Mother Agatha and Father Benedict watched with expressions of solemn approval. Within minutes, she began to feel strange. Her vision became distorted. Her thoughts seemed to move independently of her will, and reality itself began to shift and change in ways that were both terrifying and fascinating. "The sacred herbs are opening your spiritual sight," Father Benedict explained as Catherine struggled to understand what was happening to her consciousness. You are now able to perceive truths that are hidden from ordinary human awareness. What you see and experience during this time comes directly from God and must be treated as divine revelation. What Catherine experienced during these drug-induced sessions was a mixture of genuine hallucinations, carefully orchestrated psychological manipulation, and deliberate exploitation of her altered state of consciousness. Father Benedict would guide her visions through leading questions and suggestions, shaping her experiences to reinforce the convent's teachings about female sinfulness and the necessity of suffering for spiritual purification. "Tell me what you see," he would command as Catherine struggled with vivid hallucinations that seemed more real than ordinary reality. "Describe the divine figures that are appearing to you." Under the influence of the hallucinogenic herbs, Catherine would see elaborate visions of angels and saints, but these figures inevitably delivered messages that justified the abusive practices of the convent. The Virgin Mary would appear to tell her that women could only approach God through suffering. Christ himself would explain that female flesh was so corrupted that only extreme pain could purify it. Angels would demonstrate proper flagellation techniques or explain why intimate examinations by priests were necessary for spiritual health. "The Blessed Virgin is showing me that my body is a source of sin," Catherine would report during these sessions, her drugged mind unable to distinguish between genuine spiritual experience and induced hallucination. She says that only through constant pain can I hope to overcome the evil nature of my flesh. Father Benedict would carefully record these revelations, creating a written record that supposedly documented divine approval for the convent's practices. Catherine's own words, spoken while under the influence of mind-altering substances and psychological manipulation, became evidence that God himself endorsed the systematic abuse she was enduring. But the sacred vision sessions served another, more sinister purpose. While Catherine was in her drugged state, unable to think clearly or resist effectively, Father Benedict would subject her to increasingly intimate violations under the guise of spiritual healing. He claimed that the herbs made her spirit more receptive to divine grace, but also more vulnerable to demonic attack, requiring him to perform protective rituals that involved touching and manipulating her body in ways that would have been obviously abusive under normal circumstances. "The spirits are trying to enter you through your most vulnerable points," he would explain as his hands explored her body during these sessions. "I must block these entry points through sacred touch and holy oils. Your resistance to this healing shows that evil forces are fighting against your purification." Catherine's drug state made it impossible for her to understand or resist what was happening to her. The combination of hallucinogens and psychological manipulation created a dreamlike state where abuse was reframed as healing, violation was presented as protection, and her own distress was interpreted as evidence of spiritual progress. The morning after each vision session, Catherine would wake with fragmented memories of profound spiritual experiences mixed with uncomfortable physical sensations that she could not clearly recall or understand. The herbs left her with headaches, nausea, and a lingering sense of confusion that made it difficult to evaluate what had actually happened during her altered state. The divine visions are difficult for human consciousness to process, Mother Agatha would explain when Catherine expressed confusion about her experiences. The fact that you cannot clearly remember everything shows that you received truths too sacred for ordinary human understanding. You should be grateful that God has chosen to communicate with you so directly. Over time, these sessions became a regular part of Catherine's spiritual education, occurring every few weeks and always following the same pattern of drugging, manipulation, and violation disguised as divine revelation. Each session left her more confused about the boundaries between spiritual experience and abuse, more accepting of practices that would have horrified her former self, and more convinced that her suffering was not only necessary but divinely ordained. The sacred visions were perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the convent system of control, using altered consciousness to break down Catherine's ability to distinguish between genuine spirituality and elaborate exploitation. By the time she had undergone several of these sessions, she had become incapable of questioning the practices that were destroying her, because she believed they came with divine approval that she herself had witnessed. By winter, Catherine had been in the convent for 8 months, and the systematic destruction of her original personality was nearly complete. The constant cycle of confession, flagellation, examination, and drug-induced visions had reduced her to a hollow shell of her former self, compliant, submissive, and completely accepting of practices that would have horrified the young woman who had first approached the convent gates seeking spiritual peace. But the breaking point came not through any single traumatic event, but through the gradual accumulation of damage that finally overwhelmed her capacity to rationalize and accept. It began when Sister Margaret, the only person in the convent who had shown Catherine any genuine kindness, was found dead in her cell one morning after what Mother Agatha declared was an excess of spiritual fervor during private prayer. Sister Margaret achieved the ultimate spiritual victory. Mother Agatha announced to the assembled sisters as they viewed the young woman's emaciated corpse. Her flesh was so thoroughly mortified, her spirit so perfectly purified, that God called her directly to heaven during her prayers. We should rejoice at her blessed release from the corruption of earthly existence. But Catherine could see that Margaret had not died from spiritual ecstasy. The marks on her body, the signs of extreme malnutrition, and the expression of agony frozen on her face told a different story. Margaret had been killed by the convent's practices, starved, beaten, and psychologically tortured until her body simply could not endure any more abuse. The sight of her friend's corpse triggered something in Catherine's damaged psyche. A moment of clarity that cut through months of conditioning and manipulation. For the first time since entering the convent, she saw the reality of her situation without the filter of religious justification that had made the abuse seem acceptable. She was not being spiritually purified. She was being systematically destroyed by people who used religious authority to justify their sadistic impulses. The sacred practices that had broken down her resistance were not expressions of divine will, but elaborate forms of torture designed to create complete psychological submission. That night, as she lay on her straw pallet in the freezing dormitory, Catherine made a decision that would have been impossible for her just weeks earlier. She would escape the convent, no matter what the cost, before she suffered the same fate as Sister Margaret. The escape itself was surprisingly simple. The convent's walls were designed to keep people out rather than to keep prisoners in, and the sisters' movements were controlled more through psychological conditioning than physical restraint. Catherine waited until the deepest part of the night, when even the most vigilant guards would be drowsy, then made her way through corridors she had memorized during months of enforced routine. The most difficult part was not the physical challenge of climbing the walls or avoiding detection. It was overcoming the psychological conditioning that told her she was committing a terrible sin by abandoning her vows and her spiritual duties. Even as she climbed over the convent's outer wall, part of her mind was screaming that she was damning herself eternally by rejecting God's will. But the image of Margaret's tortured corpse gave her the strength to continue. Whatever sins she might be committing by escaping, they could not be worse than the slow suicide she would be completing if she remained in the convent's care. Catherine fled through the countryside in her rough woolen habit, traveling by night and hiding during the day, sustained by stolen food and the desperate hope that somewhere in the world there might be a place where spirituality did not require the complete destruction of the human spirit. She had no clear destination, no plan beyond putting as much distance as possible between herself and the convent that had nearly killed her soul. The journey was physically difficult and emotionally harrowing. The habits of submission and self-hatred that had been drilled into her over months of abuse did not disappear simply because she had recognized them as destructive. She found herself constantly questioning her decision to escape, wondering if Mother Agatha had been right about her spiritual corruption, fighting against the voice in her head that insisted she deserved whatever suffering she experienced. But gradually, as days passed and she moved farther from the convent's influence, Catherine began to remember who she had been before her religious education began. The girl who had entered the convent seeking spiritual fulfillment was still there, buried beneath layers of conditioning and trauma, but not entirely destroyed. When she finally reached a port town where ships carried passengers to distant lands, Catherine used the few coins she had stolen from the convent's treasury to purchase passage to a place where her past would not follow her. As the ship pulled away from the English coast, she watched the towers of Canterbury Cathedral disappear into the mist and made a silent vow that she would never again allow anyone to convince her that suffering was the price of salvation. She had learned that true spirituality should uplift rather than destroy, should heal rather than wound, should free the soul rather than imprison it. The convent had taught her about the darkness that could hide behind religious authority, but her escape had taught her something more valuable, that the human spirit, no matter how badly damaged, could still choose freedom over submission. Catherine had survived the medieval monastery, but she carried its scars for the rest of her life. In saving herself, she had discovered both the depths of human cruelty and the resilience of the human soul.